Good afternoon, brethren. I want to welcome and thank everyone for tuning in and joining us from the various locations from around the world for the broadcast of today's Sabbath message. Today's message will be delivered by David J. Smith, and it is titled, Change Agents, Destroying Our Children. And this is message number 496. David J. first delivered this message on February 10th, 1990. And I'm your host today, Tim West. Now, someone had mentioned this message to me recently, and I felt that it was pertinent to the state of our nation that it's in today. And stay tuned after David's message, because I will be giving a brief message titled Ideological Subversion. So let's get right into today's message, the first message. So grab something to sip on, some lunch or your favorite snack, find a comfortable place to relax, and enjoy today's message.
As the United States grew in wealth and numbers after we moved into this country and manifest destiny, and we took this country from the East Coast to the West Coast, from the Canadian border to Mexico, as time went on, we began to turn against God, our Father, and His Son, Jesus Christ. God has built into planet Earth, you might say, our system, a spiritual system, not just an ecological and physical system. In this system, there is what is called cause and effect. In Leviticus chapter 26 and Deuteronomy 28, both, it gives the principles of obedience to God produces good, while disobedience produces evil, or the opposite effect that you're looking for. When God brought His people, Israel, to Mount Sinai, He gave him His way of life. Israel knew God. They heard His voice with their own ears. Later on, in the book of Deuteronomy, God laid down a warning to Israel. In Deuteronomy 30, verse 15 to 19, I'll only hit certain phrases within those verses. He said, See, I have set before you this day life and good, death and evil. In that I command you this day to love the Lord your God, to walk in His ways, to keep His commandments and His statutes and His judgments, that you may live. So life is produced by obedience to God. And I'll drop down. But if your heart turn away, now notice what he says, if you turn your back upon God, I denounce unto you this day that you shall surely perish. I call heaven and earth to record this day against you that I, and when you look at the personal pronoun I and combine that with 1 Corinthians 10, 1-4, it's Jesus Christ, our Savior, doing the talking. I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life that both you and your seed may live. People have seed. They're called children. We have children, most of us. Those children are an heritage of God. In Hosea, he prophesied of our day, the 20th century. Notice a horrifying prediction that he made and why it was spoken. Hosea chapter 4, verse 6 and 7. My people, and this is both spiritual and physical Israel, are destroyed. The word destroyed means cut off in the Hebrew for the lack of knowledge. Because you've rejected knowledge, I will also reject you, that you should be no priests to me. Seeing that you have forgotten the law of your God, I will also forget your children. As they were increased, so they sinned against me. Therefore will I change their glory into shame. God is going to forget this nation's children. Not all children, because some children are obedient to their parents, and they're living by the law of God, and therefore they will be blessed for doing so. But how is God forgetting our children? It's because we have forgotten God's law. We as a nation have turned our back upon God. Today I want to show how, literally, God is forgetting our children and allowing those that hate us to rule over us. There's an organization founded in 1776 called the Illuminati. Today it's manifested through international world socialism. They had goals in which they wanted to achieve 7 goals. Number 1, they wanted to abolish all ordered government and then create a new government. They wanted to abolish private property, and it would be owned by the state. Number 3, they wanted to abolish all inheritance so that it would revert to the state. Number 4, abolish patriotism so that you would not be loyal to a specific country anymore, but it would be a world citizenship. Number 5, they would abolish all religion and merge it into a one-world religion of the worship of man. Number 6, they would abolish the family unit, marriage as we know it in the Christian community. They would abolish morality that is based upon Christianity and the proper education of our children. They wanted to de-educate our children and change their minds and their goals and outlook in life so that they could control them. Because the less educated an individual is, the easier they are to manipulate and control. And the 7th and final goal was to create a world government. Now, the leaders of the Illuminati realized from the very beginning that if they were to succeed in their plan to conquer and rule the world, that they had to gain control of the schools, colleges, and the universities of all nations, and especially the Christian Western nations in Europe and the United States. They also recognized the need to infiltrate and strongly influence newspapers, and in modern times, radio and television and publishing houses. The United States, Britain, and Western Europe were the nations that were targeted because they had free expression in those countries. A lady Queensberry wrote a book called Occult Theocracy in 1921. On page 581, it states this, quote, "A mind that is positive cannot be controlled. For the purpose of occult dominion, minds must therefore be rendered passive and negative in order that control may be achieved." End of quote. This should begin to tell us why the schools are in shambles today. Some years ago, a president of a small independent religious college, this was about the year 1900, stated, and I quote, "The educational system jumped the tracks of sanity and went careening off into the wilderness, and that since then the educators have been funneling poison into the plastic, unsuspecting minds of those entrusted in their care." End of quote. I want to make a statement and a comment about that quote. This was not just an accident. This was absolutely planned to happen. The educational system was planned to go awry so that they could begin to control our children. And as the socialists said, give me 2 generations of your children without God, and we'll take your country. Mr. Norman Dodd was a director of research for the Reese Committee's investigation into tax-exempt foundations. And they investigated the Carnegie Endowment. He gave a speech in Washington, D.C. on October 14th, 1976. This was reproduced in the Freeman Digest of May 1978, page 9 to 11. I'll quote just part of it. He was heading this investigation. He had access to the minutes of the books of the board meetings of the Carnegie Endowment. Those books reveal that from 1908 to 1909, the trustees of the Carnegie Foundation wanted to know the most effective way to change the lifestyle of the entire nation of the United States. They also wanted to know how to change the lifestyle of Western Europe. They came to the conclusion that war was how they would do it. Remember, this was before the seen enemy of Russia and communism took place. The next question that they asked was how to get the United States involved in a war so that they could become instrumental in changing America. They found out how. They created World War II. They said that we must control the diplomatic machinery of the United States. And the answer as to how to do that was to infiltrate the State Department. Therefore, they would control foreign policy, and if they wanted to go to war, then they would determine how to do it and how to effect it. When we entered World War I, the trustees of the Carnegie Foundation sent a telegram to President Wilson urging him not to end the war too quickly because they had already begun to see the alteration of the lifestyle in the United States. When the war was over, the Carnegie Endowment had yet another problem: how to keep the United States from reverting back to the old lifestyle they had before World War I. The answer was they had to gain control of the educational system in America. And according to the Carnegie Minute books that Mr. Dodd read and took copies of and presented them before the Senate Committee on Un-American Activities, the trustees divided the task of education between themselves, the Carnegie Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation. The Rockefeller Foundation would begin to alter education pertaining to domestic subjects internally in the United States by funding textbooks, by funding education institutions to train teachers. And then the Carnegie Endowment would work on an international scale to re-educate every nation on earth toward globalism. Together they decided that the teaching of American history had to be changed. It had to be revised. So they selected certain men who were in the upper echelon in the Eastern establishment. They sent them to London through Guggenheim Foundation fellowships. They trained these individuals on the new force in American history. It became known as the American Historical Society. They began to rewrite textbooks and change history so that our founding fathers would look like aristocrats. They were selfish. They were not seeking the good of the people of America. And they were not good men, but evil men. As America entered into the decade of the 30s, the Commission of Social Studies of the American Historical Society issued what they call conclusions and recommendations. This was in 1934. This was funded by the Carnegie Corporation. Excerpts of this particular report are found in a Mr. Rene Wormser's book called Foundations, page 146 and 148. Now, Mr. Wormser was the legal counsel for the Reese Committee while they were investigating these foundations. The report states that even though this is not true, this is what they were trying to achieve through the educational system. That the age of individualism is over, and the laissez-faire in economy and governments is closing. Our free economic system, the way we know it, is over, and that age is closing out, and that a new age of collectivism is emerging. It goes on to say that this collectivism is one of integration of all nations and educational systems and interdependence of all economies on earth, making it a global economy, and this would wipe out individualism all over the world. In their recommendations, they called on teachers to free themselves from the traditional academic pursuits and convert schools into agencies to create a new society. He also stated on page 148 and 49, the school boards were to support a school program marked by transition to some form of a socialized economy. End of quote. This is the public school systems in which we send our children. A Professor Harold J. Lasky, who was the professor of British socialism, he testified before the Reece Committee. He said that the Commission's report, this I'm quoting him, at bottom and stripped of its carefully neutral phrases, the program is an educational program for a socialized America. End of quote. This was found in the Reece Committee report, page 141, as quoted in Wormser's books. On April 24th of 1920, the Joint Legislative Committee investigating seditious activities filed in the Senate of the State of New York a 4-volume report known as the Lusk Report. The general introduction of Volume 1 states, and I quote, "Those representing the socialist point of view are the Socialist Party of America, the Communist Party of America, the Communist Labor Party, and the Socialist Labor Party. A study of their platforms and official pronouncements shows that they do not differ fundamentally in their objectives. These objectives are," here it is, "the same as now is being taught in the educational institutions. The establishment of a cooperative commonwealth in the place of our present form of government. The overthrow of what they are pleased to call the capitalist system, namely the present system under which we live, and the substitution in its place of collective ownership and the management of the means of production and distribution by the working class." End of quote. Their goal was to centralize power in Washington, D.C. If they could do that, they would only have one battle to win. If they could take the states' rights away from them, they wouldn't have 50 separate battles to win to socialize America. So how did they do that? The 10th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States states, and I quote, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution are reserved to the states respectively or to the people." End of quote. Now, nowhere in the Constitution does the government, the federal government, are they given any power or control over education or many of the other fields that they're in, such as health, welfare, dams, labors, public power projects, agriculture, unemployment, and housing. None of those things are mentioned in the Constitution, and they have no right to have anything to do with it. But there were 2 men, one of them Nikita Khrushchev, and one of them a communist in the United States. They both stated that we would pass legislation in this country and one day wake up and be a socialist country. How are we doing that in America? When federal funds are used to support education or any other field of endeavor, the federal government uses control over these areas in varying degrees. Notice why the liberals, socialists, communists, the Illuminati want the federal government to subsidize every area of government, especially education. The United States Supreme Court, in the case of Wickard versus Filburn in 1942, included the final statement in their decision, I quote, "It is hardly a lack of due process for government to regulate that which it subsidizes." End of quote. With every new law that the federal government passes, that they send money to the states, they control that area of the state economy. And it takes states' rights away from the people. So to control education, they had to fund education. Therefore, they would have the right to control it. At this point now, I want to ask a question. What is a change agent? A change agent is a person, it can be an organization, it can be an institution that changes or helps to change the behavior or beliefs, values, or attitudes of people without the people's consent or even knowledge that those changes are being made. The purpose of most of the activity that takes place in what is called the public schools today, and many times even in private and church schools, is not to change the child by developing his intellect through mathematics, the true history of America, through geometry and that type thing. Rather, the purpose is to change the values, the attitudes, the behavior of those students and replace it with new beliefs and new behavior patterns that will render those children susceptible to manipulation, coercion, and control for the rest of their life. In reality, what they're doing in the public schools today is de-educating children. They are passing them socially rather than holding them back so that they will learn absolute fundamental basic skills so they can have jobs in society. It should be kept in mind as I'm talking that the term change agent is the very creation of the government of the United States and of the Department of Education established by former President Carter. Change agent is a government term and an educational term given to it by the government of the United States. What does humanism have to do in the schools today? What is a public school? I'll make a statement now. Public schools do not exist. Public schools do not exist. By the word public, it literally implies belonging to or controlled by the people. Schools are thought to be places where children go to study and to learn the ABCs, or the triple R's, reading, writing, arithmetic, all the fundamental things that causes the brain to have an intellect so that you can support a family in today's society. Public schools today do not fit that description at all. Not anymore. If public schools are controlled by the people in the community, and if public schools are not primarily places of academic education, then what are they? If they're not controlled by the people in the community, then who does control them? I think this is important because we're going to find out that every humanistic tenet of the human manifesto, Humanist Manifesto 2 of 1973, is the deliberate program in the schools today to create a worship of man and eliminate God from the minds of our children. Who controls the public schools? The government does, either directly or indirectly at the state or the federal level, because they support them through tax money. And every time money goes into the school systems, then this means the federal government, because of the Filburn versus Wickard decision in 1942, gives them control. Therefore, they have the control over the curriculum development, teacher training, what teachers learn and how they teach, the materials that go into the classroom, the materials that are distributed to teachers to teach from, research in the educational field, all because of the Wickard versus Filburn Act of 1942. The result is that the local school systems are mere administrative agencies of the state or the federal government. And local school boards, as one man who runs a business in Bridgeton, Missouri, found out after he was elected, is merely a window dressing to make it appear that the local people control the school. And he has found out that he has no control whatsoever. All orders come down from the federal or state because of the money given to the local school system. It would be more accurate to call the public schools government schools. Or if you want to even get more accurate, they would be government centers of indoctrination, because they only want to indoctrinate our children with what they want they want them to know. If they are not places of academic learning, now some children rise above, and they do learn, and they do become educated in spite of the system. If they are not centers of academic learning, as most of us, about 50 or more, it was when we were young, then what are they? I'm going to let them tell us. I will quote the article, Process-Centered Education for a Changing Tomorrow, that appeared in Intellect Magazine, November 1973, page 101. The concept of learning a particular amount of content as a preparation for life is obsolete and must be abandoned. End of quote. The purpose is no longer to prepare children to face life and to be educated and live in our modern society. I will now quote Mr. Carl Rogers, his article, The Impersonal Relationship in the Facilitation of Learning. If learning a particular amount of content, the preparation of life, is now obsolete, I've got a question. What are our children doing from 9 a.m. or 8:30 or 7:30 till 3 p.m.? Here it is, quote, the goal of education is the facilitation of change, end of quote. He says they're there to change their behavior, change their thought processes, not educate them to prepare them for life. So what are government schools for? You notice I didn't say public schools. They are government-controlled schools. One of the 10 planks to the Communist Manifesto, free education for all children. They are administrative government agencies that exist to promote change in our children. But what kind of changes? Social change, political change, economic change, to accept socialism, cultural change, religious change, even the change in the form of our government. In other words, total change of all our thought processes from the way we grew up and the values of Christian America to a different type of system. Government schools are striving to destroy the status, structure, and the stability of the family, just like Adam Weishaupt laid down in 1776 for the Illuminati. Strong families make a strong nation, and they must be eliminated if the proposed world dictatorship is to be established and maintained. Look at all the families of people that you know. Look at your own circumstance in some cases, in my own circumstance. Are families building and growing together, or are they being destroyed because of the new age movement of liberation of women, thinking that they don't have to be in subjection to their own husbands and this type thing? This is exactly what's promoted in our government schools today. Chaos, that's what's planned, and it's working. And Christian America has fell into the trap. So public schools don't exist, they're government schools. The incredible hoax and ultimate tragedy that government schools will serve as change agents for the destruction of Western Christianity is here. It's here. They are working for a new world order. When you look at the basic structure of socialism, humanism, you will find that all of their tenets and beliefs are identical. So humanism is nothing more than socialism. Now let's make sure we understand what is meant by socialism and humanism. Now under political socialism, there is a collective or government ownership and control of all production, the distribution of goods, and they control all property. There's also corporate socialism. This is what is in place in a large degree in America today. Corporations go around and buy up other corporations, the great merger mania that's going on in America. And in the writings of the Illuminati, discovered in 1905 and translated into English by Mr. Marsden of the London Post, they stated that at a certain time they would begin to create monopolies in the marketplace so that they would totally control all business in the Western world. They already control it in the communist countries, don't they? So now all they do is put it in the hands of a few individuals who are working for world government. So what they do is they go in, a giant corporation, and builds a whole shopping center. They own and control that shopping center. Then individual merchants in that area may lease the place, but they don't own the property, do they? And the first time they can't pay their rent, they're closed down. So corporations own it, and it is socialism on the corporate level. Now, humanism is just a little more difficult to define, and yet it's basically the same thing. It's misused in many ways because people think when you talk about humanism, oh, you're talking about being good and doing good to humanity. That is not true, the way they use the word humanism. Humane simply means to be good, kind to animals, to other human beings, to try to take care of their everyday needs and necessities. This is the golden rule. We should all be that way, but that's not what humanism is, and humanism is what's being taught in the public schools. And I will quote their statements to prove it before I'm through. Humanism is promoted in the government schools today, and it's what our country has already been converted to a large degree. Now, humanism is a religious philosophy, religion, with articles of faith, and every one of them are listed in the Humanist Manifesto that was given in 1933, then it was updated in 1973. You can write to Prometheus Books, Buffalo, New York, and it was published in 1973, and get Humanist Manifestos, both 1 and 2. Humanism as a religion in our schools. I want to discuss that a moment. It has been legally recognized by the courts in America that humanism is a religion. I refer you to the case of Torcaso versus Watkins, number 367, United States Report, page 495. Here's what it said, quote, "Among religions in this country which do not teach what would generally be considered a belief in the existence of God are Buddhism, Taoism, ethical culture, secular humanism." End of quote. So humanism is a religion. It has been stated so by the Supreme Court of the United States. It was also tried the first time in the courts, Washington Ethical Society versus the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C. And then it went on to the Supreme Court. So secular humanism is a religion. Now, in the March of 1978, Educational Leadership, this is a book written by a Mr. James K. Uphoff. He cited the narrow definition of religion, which centers around belief in and a worship of a deity or God. He also gave a broad definition of religion, which, and I quote, envisions religion as any faith or set of values to which an individual or group gives ultimate loyalty. And then he quotes ethical culture, secularism, humanism, scientism illustrate this concept of religion. End of quote. So secular humanism is a religion but does not believe in a personal God. See? Now, this particular author went on and he gave the broad definition again. Quote, "It applies to all of us. We educators have placed our faith in the critical thinking process as a means of improving our world, and we may have adopted it as a religious value." End of quote. He went on later on page 439 and said, quote, "My own faith in the value of and need of rationality makes me become a missionary and undertake the task with great zeal." End of quote. And this is humanism. That man is the center of the universe, not God. That man is God unto himself, not an outside deity that we worship. Humanism, and they are using it, or they are missionaries in our school system. Now, humanists in the schools are very, very dedicated. If Christians were as dedicated to promoting our way of life and standing for it as they were, things may be reversed. Now, an educator by the name of Harold L. Lyons described a course that he gave in what is called affective education. A-F-F-E-C-T-I-V-E, affective education. He said, and I quote, "The intangible product of the course is 15 humanistically enlightened individuals who are now either teaching their own humanistically oriented classes or working as missionaries to influence others to deal with feelings in the classroom and in curriculum development." End of quote. So he says the goal of every humanist is to teach 15 other humanists who go on into the educational system. And then that way it spreads all over the system. It's just interesting that our president, Mr. George Bush, belongs to an organization where 15 individuals are selected every year to go into that secret organization called Skull and Bones from Yale University. I wonder why he uses 15 here. Just interesting. Now, humanists they're just as protective of their religion as most Christians should be, if not more so. They actually came out in the winter 1970 issue of Religious Humanism and stated that if anyone attacks humanism, then they should defend it to the hilt. Well, what about humanistic education today? Schools are said to be promoting humanistic education or to be developing humane qualities. If it was humane qualities, that would sound good. That would be okay. But they use terminology and it has one meaning to them, but it has a different meaning to the parents. Therefore, when parents go and counsel about their students, the parents go away saying, "Oh, my son or daughter is doing great," when their grades don't show they're doing great. And when they can't even read 4- and 5-letter words, and yet they're given great reports, something has to be wrong. To most people, in their thinking, humanistic education means schools are exerting a very civilizing influence on their children. They're teaching them to read, write, do their arithmetic, and training them for society. These are very humane qualities. But that is not what humanistic education means. I want to let the educators themselves tell you what they mean. According to William Russell, he's the program officer for the federally funded National Endowment for the Humanities. In August 1978, he stated, I quote, "An initial clarification to make is that the term humanistic is not the adjective form of the noun humanities. Humanistic education does not mean education in the humanities disciplines." End of quote. Well, if it doesn't mean education in the humanities discipline or what we think our children are being taught in the schools, then what does it mean? In an article entitled "To Nurture Humaneness," this was by Mary Margaret Scobie. I quote, "It is not enough that we simply teach the humanities. Instruction in English, social studies, art, music, and drama is not enough. Humanism and the humanities are by no means synonymous." End of quote. So what we think our children are learning, and then all of a sudden they're taught humanistic education, they say they are not the same at all. And yet now our children are being given a humanistic education. Well, if we know what humanistic education is not, and it is not reading, writing, and arithmetic, the basic things that I learned when I was growing up, then what is humanistic education? A good example and explanation was given by a California assemblyman by the name of John Vasconcellos. In March of 1974, he wrote, I quote, this is an article, The Humanization of Education. Quote, humanizing education isn't easy. It's at least controversial and at most subversive. It's subversive because it attempts at truly humanizing the public schools, and it must run smack up against the fundamental social realities. In other words, it smacks at everything anti-Christian there is. It promotes the man as the center of the universe instead of God. Man-centered education instead of God-centered education. I'll continue. It's controversial because it necessarily raises, even challenges, the very deepest held values and assumptions about human beings. It includes the affective and the cognitive domains. I'll define those in education in just a moment. It recognizes a child has a mind of his own, has feelings, has a body, physical and sexual, needing to touch and be touched. End of quote. He went on and elaborated on this self-determination. A child should be able to choose for himself what's right and wrong. Then he went on and elaborated on what he meant by the term autonomy, that a child should be autonomous from its parents. He said that a child needed to be able to look inward to himself and not outward toward a deity or his parents for guidance. He lauded evolution over creation. In essence, Mr. Vasconcellos promoted every tenet of the Articles of Faith of the Humanist Manifesto. And this was humanistic education, as he defined it. Now, what is supposed to be the benefit of such humanistic education? According to an educator by the name of Morel J. Clute, quote, humanistic schools work to free people, end of quote. But the question is, free them from what? Another educator, William D. Hedges, answered, I quote, this view of humankind requires the educative process to free people to be themselves. It values autonomy, which means separation from parental influence, and interdependence. Isn't that what's happening all over the world? International and world socialism. It decries the imposition of constraints and conventions which can retard the individual's growth. End of quote. So literally what he is saying is that if there's anything such as the Ten Commandments that says you shall not commit adultery, and you can subdivide that and mean not covet, young people should have no wrong feelings and actions about sex. That is a constraint. We must free these children from all constraints of the Bible. They say it with their own words. They stated, this is in humanistic education, that it is not value-free. An educator by the name of Harold C. Lyons said, and I quote, humanistic education is not value-free. They have their own set of values. I'll continue. If it is to be in any way a personal, humanizing experience, one accepts the facts that both students and teachers have a worldview or values set through which each interprets facts. End of quote. In other words, each individual is autonomous, so he has to interpret facts for him or herself and not let the parents try to teach them, or ministers, theologians, teach them their value system, but each person is free to have his or her own value system based upon whatever he or she thinks is right or wrong, totally separate from parents. That was quoted from an article called Learning to Feel, Feeling to Learn, page 153. So this worldview is very much a part of the humanistic belief. The humanists also interpret facts. Now, how can you interpret a fact? 2 plus 2 is 4. That's a fact. And yet they're saying 2 plus 2 may be 4. This is what they're doing. They interpret facts because they don't believe anything is absolutely true. Truth is relative. It becomes situational. According to the circumstance you find yourself, something may be true or it may not be true. Instead of always a fact or a truth is truth, regardless of the circumstance. They've turned it just backwards. Well, the humanist movement in our schools, I want to give another quote now. Humanistic education is a movement. I'm quoting their educator, Mr. Lyon, page 289. Rather than a discipline. And in other words, instead of arithmetic, and you go and you learn basic algebra, algebra 1, algebra 2, geometry, trigonometry, instead of learning an absolute truth. No, they say humanistic education is not truth. It is not absolutism. He says it lacks a sound theoretical base. It has nothing to base truth upon. And there is little research to prove or disprove or improve its techniques. Those of us who are presently working in the field that's of humanistic education are anxious to see it legitimatize. End of quote. Here is something that can't be proved true, has no truth to it, and yet they are working feverishly to make it the legitimate religion in the school. To replace absolute truth like mathematics, true sciences. Humanism in the schools didn't just happen. It's a result of a movement, and this Harold Lyon said so. It was led and promoted by a Mr. John Dewey in the 1930s. He was not responsible for it. He only was trained to introduce it into the American system. A more contemporary missionary of humanism in the schools today is a well-known man by the name of Arthur Combs, C-O-O-M-B-S. In 1966, he defined the humanistic movement. Quote, "The humanistic movement finds expression in many places. Internationally, it appears in the rise and independence of the undeveloped nations, in the United Nations, the World Court, or the freedom of women." End of quote. So you begin to see that he doesn't say humanistic education and humanism is just for school system. He even identifies things that I've talked about as a part of the world conspiracy for the beast to rise in Revelation 13. And he identifies it in educational literature. Now, bear in mind that he made that statement in 1966. Now I'd like to give a 1978 statement, the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development. They published this report by Arthur Combs. I quote, "The humanistic movement came into being very largely in response to this fundamental change in human problems, such as ecology." Do you see ecology all over the news media everywhere today? Humanism. Starvation. Do they show us starving children all over the world now? And how we can actually send money and support a child for so many dollars a month? Conservation. What about the energy crisis in 1973? That was a hoax. The easiest provable thing there was. People who had friends and relatives who worked for Mobil Oil said their tankers set off in the Mediterranean Sea, down here in the Caribbean, off the Pacific coast, and wouldn't let their oil come in, and said, oh, we don't have oil. But it was sitting 2 and 3 miles offshore. Plenty of oil. No, they're just trying to control us, just like they are through the schools. One sees the fruits of this movement, humanistic movement, in such worldwide developments such as the decline of colonialism. Who is it responsible for dismantling the British Empire? Giving away all of America's seaports, now going to take Panama away. The naval and air bases in the Philippines. Yep, it's all a part of this humanistic movement. The World Court, that's what he said in 1966. Now in 1978, he's saying the same thing. The United Nations. Now he adds UNESCO, and of all things, look what he adds now as part of the humanistic world order movement. Public education. End of quote. So in 12 short years, because Mr. Jimmy Carter made our public education system a government school system controlled by humanism and socialism, now he has listed public education as part of the worldwide development of the spread of humanism. Well, the humanistics, those backing this, are fiercely determined to achieve their aims of this movement. They're so determined, in fact, that Arthur Combs declared, and I quote from the Educational Leadership, April 1966, page 530, quote, "The tide of human affairs is running with the humanistic movement, and it is inexorable." In other words, it is non-stoppable. It will not be stopped. Though habit and tradition, and that's Christian tradition, may kick up waves of opposition from time to time, these are but surface manifestations. Those great tides in human affairs, meaning the rise of socialism and humanism, are disastrous to oppose. In other words, if Christians, you oppose it, you're in for disaster. I believe, and this I'm quoting him, I believe the humanist movement is one of those tides that can't be stopped, and it is coming in. End of quote. This is what our students are learning in the schools. World citizenship. Just like former Governor Thompson of Illinois put out an official certificate and declared all citizens of Illinois citizens of the world. Mr. Combs also stated in 1966, I quote, "The humanistic movement is not fad or frill. It is an absolute necessity for our times. If it didn't exist, we would have to invent it." End of quote. So is there a conspiracy against our children? Yes, there is. And it's called government schools, one of the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. So the humanists are determined not to be stopped. They believe the humanistic movement in our schools is an absolute necessity to fashion the minds of those individuals who will grow up and be leaders in society tomorrow. Not today. But the humanist movement is not only carried on by humanist educators in the schools. They have people in great power and influence in the entertainment industry, the mass media, particularly in our legislative bodies all across the nation. To be exact, California Assemblyman John Vasconcellos, that I've already mentioned, was one of them. He was a champion of humanism in education. And another California congressman, Mr. Don Edwards, on October 23rd, 1973, gave a talk. Here's what he said in part, I quote, "I wish I was able to tell you that the Humanist Manifesto 2 has been read by 535 members of Congress, by the Supreme Court, by the CIA, by the Pentagon, and by all those various people at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And that further, they have declared unanimously that henceforth it would be the cornerstone of American foreign and domestic policy. I wish I could say that, but I can't. It doesn't mean that this important document is not on Capitol Hill, that it is not going to have a great deal of influence in the dialogue that will go on for many years. End of quote. Even though it has not been accepted by everybody on Capitol Hill, it is there, and he said so. That is why most of the legislation today comes straight out of the Humanist Manifesto, and it is nothing more than the same groundwork for international socialism. Now do we understand why the courts of this country stated that you cannot pray or have Bible reading of any Christian in schools? Because that's a part of the Humanist Manifesto too. You cannot have religion in schools. To be exact, a woman by the name of Madeleine Murray O'Hair, most of us have heard of her. She was an atheist. She's made a statement in 1978. I quote, "Let's face it, there is no way we could have an atheist convention or had an atheist convention 10 years ago. Everything today is much better. Part of the reason is public education." End of quote. Madeleine O'Hara, and this was quoted in the Catholic Review, Baltimore, Maryland. So because of public education for the last 30 to 40 years based upon humanism, now atheism is accepted in this country. No belief in God, and atheists can now have, and homosexuals too, can have open conventions, and it's accepted. Whatever happened to the cry against ungodliness in this country? I don't know. It's gone down the tubes. Well, I want to discuss in the last few minutes that I have some of the articles of faith of the Humanist Manifesto, and you will be able to see very clearly how they have dominated the American life in the last few years. Just as you and I have absolute doctrinal beliefs based upon the Bible, the Humanist Manifesto too is the Bible for international socialism. To be exact, it's a blueprint through which they're striving to change religion, politics, social and personal mores in America, and what is taught or promoted in the government schools. It is the blueprint. I'll discuss religion first. The Humanist Manifesto says this, I quote, "We believe that traditional, dogmatic, or authoritarian religions," that's me, folks, based upon the one and only God Almighty in His Bible, "that place revelation, God, ritual, or creed above human needs and experience do a disservice to the human species." You and I in this room right now are one of the worst serviceable people to the human species according to the humanists there is. They say as non-theist, they're watering down saying, hey, we're atheist. As atheist, we begin with humans, not God. End of quote. How many of the so-called Protestant denominations and even the Catholic Church have become totally man-centered? How many today are worried about people out in the ghettos and long food lines and supplying the poor and so on, rather than the absolute dogmatic truth of the Bible first? Think about it. That's exactly their purpose. Put humanism in the churches so they never speak truth. They say, oh, you don't love these people if you don't go give all you have to the people in the poor areas. Jesus said you'll always have the poor with you. But come take up your cross and follow me. We're not going to change this world till Jesus comes. That's the point. As long as there's Satan and his demons and all the degenerate character traits that we have that destroys instead of builds up. This world will remain this way until Jesus comes. We can only alleviate someone temporarily by giving them a piece of bread and meat, maybe, or buying them a meal. We can't cure the poverty of the world. Jesus will do it. The schools today begin with humans, not God. I've seen on the news reports in the last couple of nights how many students have been overdosing on drugs in the Pattonville School District. One just yesterday. And then down in the school district, I think down in Jefferson County. All because there is not a God-centered school in America anymore. It begins with man. And if man is not satisfied with his or her lot in life, they teach the appropriate way for suicide in the schools today. Let's go on with the Humanist Manifesto. Quote, promises of immortal salvation, isn't that us? Or fear of damnation are both illusory and harmful. There is no credible evidence that life survives the death of the body. End of quote. And you know what? That's right. That's the whole hope of the Bible, the resurrection from the dead. But how many Christians in the world today, friends that you know of that claim to be Christian, do not even believe that sin is real anymore? That sin is not possible anymore. They're not worried about how they live because they believe that once they're saved, they're always saved, and that they're never going to lose salvation no matter how they live, what kind of a lifestyle. Humanism. That's what it is. Humanistic death education in the schools and even in the churches is helping people to accept death as finality rather than teaching them the hope of the resurrection from the dead. All because of the Humanist Manifesto being taught in the schools. They say that if we teach people that to fear death, and if our life's not ready before then, we're doing a disservice. Well, what about morality? Humanist Manifesto says, quote, ethics is autonomous. You have your own choice to make, and I have my own choice. Nobody else can tell us what's right and what's wrong. God can't do it because there's not a God. They say they're non-theist. In other words, they're atheist. Ethics is autonomous and situational, needing no theological, that's a religious or ministerial or ideological sanction. We strive for the good life here and now, because when you die, you're like Rover. You're dead all over. There's no hope. See? That's the way they believe. And they're teaching our children that there is no hope. Therefore, you have to get while the getting is good. And you must satisfy every nerve ending, every taste bud, everything that excites the emotions today, you must experience it. Because when you die, you'll never experience anything again. This has caused our young people to be alienated from our parents. It has put them in a state of despair because they have no hope. They have no structure, no standards by which to guide them, and so they overdose. They are taught in the schools a right to suicide if you're not satisfied with your life. This is the humanistic belief. What about your individual behavior? What about humanism? What does it say? I quote the Humanist Manifesto. We believe in maximum individual autonomy. They believe that you as an individual, and they teach it, that all situations are based upon your own personal belief. Parents and other authority figures cannot and should not influence a child who has now been liberated from all laws, any type of rules of conduct, any type of regulatory rules that's established. Nothing higher than himself, including God, has any say-so over their lives. This is what's being promoted in the schools. And we wonder why the decline in morality in the last 30 years in our young people. They have deliberately been set upon. They have not known what was going on. It's been deliberate. The Humanist Manifesto says, I quote, "The right to birth control, abortion, and divorce should be recognized. Neither do we wish to prohibit by law or social sanction sexual behavior between consenting adults." That means male, female, two women, or two men. They say live like animals, because when you die, you're dead. Individuals should be permitted to express their sexual proclivities and pursue their lifestyles as they desire. End of quote. This smacks at everything that is against Christianity. When you read the Bible in Romans chapter 1, it lays bare what happened when these people reject God and the knowledge of Him. It says the same thing. It says their minds are darkened and they turn to every perverted lifestyle there is. And they're turning our children. God said, because you have forgotten the law of your Lord, of your God, I will also forget your children. Brethren, we haven't forgotten God's law. Let's not let our children be caught up in these things. Let's teach them the difference in humanism and God's perfect way of life, so that when they're forced to go to these government schools, and even many Christian schools, if they receive any type of support from the government, then they have to teach their curriculum. Then they will know the difference. You know, in the schools today, this has been a controversy even on national television. Schools will actually teach children they have a right to do anything they want sexually. The parents have no right to tell them what to do. They become pregnant, or they become infected with venereal disease. And so the schools now are even having backup measures in case what they've now taught the students, they don't have to go home and confess all this to the parents. They can now go to a school clinic and eradicate the VD, or have contraception given to them so they can carry on their mischievous lifestyle, or they can even get an abortion. And so schools are now being forced, it's like a circle. You teach them immorality, they perform it, then you also provide a solution to salve their conscience. And that way the parents don't have to know what's going on. Well, the Humanist Manifesto says, I quote, "The individual must experience a full range of civil liberties. This includes a recognition of an individual's right to die with dignity, euthanasia, and the right to suicide." End of quote. Now do we understand why there's been court cases going on to allow easy death for the elderly? Now do we understand why there's suicide is the number 2 cause of death for teenagers today in America? Because the Humanist Manifesto says anybody on earth that wants to commit it has a right to. The children are taught there is no hope. Once you're dead, that's it. So they want to commit suicide and get it over with. The Humanist Manifesto says, I quote, "All persons should have a voice in developing the values and goals that determine their lives. Alienating forces should be modified or eradicated." End of quote. One more little statement down in that particular article I want to mention. It says people are more important than decalogues. What's a decalogue? When you look in Exodus 20, verse 1 through 17, there is a decalogue called the 10 Commandments. Right here in the Humanist Manifesto, it says all people who teach decalogues are more important than your own personal choice of how you live, must either modify their position and quit enforcing the decalogue upon these people, or they must be eradicated. Do we understand why Christianity is predicted in the book of Revelation and Daniel to be persecuted? Because you and I are going to teach God's law. And when we teach it, they say, you change your mind and don't teach it, or you will be eradicated. This is what's being taught in our schools today. Value education declares that parents are no longer permitted to instill their values in their own children. I had so much today that I wanted to say, but I'm not going to be able to say it all, so I'll continue at another time. So I do want to bring it to a conclusion, though. The Apostle Paul foretold the end result of human beings who literally made themselves the center of the universe instead of God, the center of all things. Paul said that as a result of this humanist manifesto, he didn't call it that, I will, that eventually there would come a man. He would believe that he is God because he doesn't believe in an external God that we're responsible to. And in 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 4, he said that this man would oppose and exalt himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he as God would sit in the temple of God, showing himself that he was God. This is going to be the end result of what is being taught in the schools today and accepted and forced upon the people. And you know what? The prophet Daniel backed him up in that statement. He wrote of the humanist in Daniel chapter 11 verse 36. He said that a man would exalt himself as God, and the king shall do according to his will. That's the beast, or what many people in Christianity call the Antichrist, the end-time dictator. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods. And how do you speak against the God of gods? You say he don't exist, for one thing. You say his laws are obsolete. They've got to be eradicated. And shall prosper. So this individual, when he comes on the scene, he's going to do well. People are going to accept him till the indignation be accomplished. For that is determined shall be done. So whatever God's program is, it will be accomplished. The humanist-run schools are training our children to accept man as God. I hope we as individuals will reverse the trend and teach our children that God is God and man is subject to God.
Well, hello again, brethren. Thank you for joining us, and I hope everyone enjoyed the message today titled, Change Agents Destroying Our Children. Now, these change agents have done a fantastic work on our children over the years, which is only one small piece of a larger puzzle, of a strategically precision war to attain a single goal. When we look across the United States today, we see mass confusion and animosity. And to make sense of this, we need to identify the driving force of this aggression. When we look at this form of from a communistic point of view, we see that the real driving force of this war of aggression is ideology. Something we can't eat, wear, or save for a rainy day. It's an integral part of this ideological war is ideological subversion. The process of changing the perception of reality in the minds of millions of people all over the world. And there's a revered book from many years ago titled The Art of War, and it is traditionally ascribed to Sun Tzu as the author. It presents a philosophy of war for managing conflicts and winning battles. It is accepted as a masterpiece on strategy and has been frequently cited and referred to by generals and theorists since it was first published, translated, and distributed internationally. The book declares that the first rule of war is to know your enemy. It also states that all warfare is based primarily on deception of an enemy, and that fighting on a battlefield is the most primitive way of making war. And it goes on to state that there is no art higher than to destroy your enemy without a fight, by subverting anything of value in the enemy's country. Now, currently, here in the United States, we are living in an open society. We all have the opportunity to choose to work or choose not to work. We can choose to purchase and own private property or own nothing at all. We are entitled to be able to love our country or leave the country. We are free to criticize it without fear of being declared the enemy of the people, although we can see that they're currently hammering away at the destruction of freedom of speech. But basically, our society is based on free individual initiative and a free market system. And all a subverter has to do to upset the status quo of a free nation is to borrow one false idea from the ideology of the communist or totalitarian government. Excuse me, my throat's drying up here. I didn't get any sleep. Anyway, for example, let's examine the idea of egalitarianism, meaning people being born equal, therefore they must be equal. And that does sound pretty benevolent in and of itself. We are all born with equal opportunity, but are we truly born equal? We're all born at different weights and lengths. We are different physically, mentally, emotionally, racially, spiritually, etc. And it sounds pretty diverse to me. So let's look at a hypothetical implementation of legislative equality and make the concept of equality the cornerstone and pillar of a socio-economical and political system. It doesn't take a renowned economist or sociologist to recognize that some of the people who are less equal would demand as much as those who are more equal. And they would demand it by means of law. There will always be those who get more for giving less and take advantage of those who are even less equal. In, say, the art of taking. Well, we then introduce the state as a third force to avoid any argument of equal distribution. And the beauty of the best, most successful political economic system created by the founding fathers of America has nothing to do with legislated or enforced equality. The American Republic is based on the principle of equal opportunity for unequal and very much different and diverse individuals to develop their abilities and to coexist in a mutually beneficial cooperation. People who have declared themselves to be equal will inevitably come to expect more for their individual needs, who sooner or later will unfortunately find themselves in a conflict with the unequal reality, which automatically produces discontent. Unhappy and discontent masses are less productive than, say, those who are happy being who they are and making the best of it. Decreased productivity, as we all know, leads to such unpleasant things as inflation, unemployment, and recession. These in turn cause social unrest and instability, both politically and economically. Now, chronic instability breeds radicalism as a means of solving a problem, and radicalism is the precondition of a power struggle, which may and often does result in violent and forceful replacements of power structures. And keep in mind, the seat of presidency in the United States is a power structure. Now, if the situation deteriorates badly, this replacement takes dreadful forms of internal civil war or revolution or invasion of a friendly neighbor, and finally ends up in the traditional result, specifically state control. Now, depending on the maturity of a nation and the amount of absence or common sense, this control will manifest itself in the creation of a closed society, the opposite of what we currently possess. Now, where the borders are closed, censorship of the media is established, irritants and enemies of the state are executed, etc. Anyone can easily observe the vicious chain of events by simply reading the newspapers, watching TV, or browsing social media. Brethren, we need to stay focused on the real reason as to why these things are happening in the world today. When we look at each piece of the puzzle individually, it all appears as mass chaos. But in reality, each piece of the puzzle is an integral part of a well-organized war strategy known as ideological subversion, the destructive tool that's used by the communist regime to dismantle a nation. Until we meet again, do not accept the mark of the beast, and let's make all our days worthy of God's blessings. May you all have a blessed week, and goodbye for now.